isn't here, and we'll just have a conversation. And if during the process, if you could rephrase my question so that my voice isn't gonna be on the tape.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I fail to, you just remind me?
Sure.
Okay. Because I'll probably start the answer before I restate the question, but...
That's okay, most people do. Occasionally we get somebody.
I think we usually get it on the first question, and then it pretty much falls.
Go on
And it
after
gets
that.
more to a conversation, but that's perfectly fine.
Okay.
So, if we were recording,
We're good to
if
go.
you could state your first and last.
Ron Netzel, Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders, Health and Human Services.
Okay, great. The first question for you would be, where were you when you first heard about the events of 9/11?
I was just going into class that morning. Class started at 10 o'clock. And the second tower, I believe, had just been hit about that time. And so I turned it into a class discussion. We had about 12 students, graduate students, and everyone's aware of it, so I could see that there wasn't much sense in talking about the content when something of this magnitude was on everybody's mind. So we just sort of had an open discussion.
What came about through those discussions?
Not much. That was more of the shock level, and it wasn't clear at all exactly what had happened, to what extent, was it over, and most of these people had never experienced any kind of trauma of that magnitude, nor had I. But I grew up in the shadow of World War II and Korea, Vietnam, all the intervening wars and conflicts we've had. So I knew, I had some experience with this territory being attacked by outsiders, but nothing of this magnitude, so I was probably in as much shock as anybody else.
When you started finding out about the particular events that took place that morning, what were some of your first initial feelings and reactions?
My first thought was, don't do anything quickly. Don't act out of misinformation, lack of information. Do the best fact-finding missions you can do before you take any kind of military action in particular. That was my overriding concern.
How'd you, once you found out the facts, how did that play into your feelings when you thought about it?
Well, as we gained information, however factual it might be, I was thankful for every day that went by that we didn't do something, very reactionary in terms of military strike. So despite the president's initial words of smoke them out of their holes, bomb them back into the Stone Age, that kind of rhetoric, which really concerned me. As time passed and days passed, I was hopeful and optimistic that he was getting a lot of input as to how to best respond to this.
How'd you deal with some of those initial feelings, maybe anger, confusion, or?
Mostly frustration, just a sense of helplessness, I think, that most people have probably experienced, followed by what can and should we do about this. I remember writing some notes about 5 days afterward. I had like my own 6-point plan as to what we should do. And, so I'm kind of a get the information and make the most appropriate response you can. I'm that kind of individual, but I do want resolution, and as soon as is reasonable.
How would you say you channeled all that energy?
Mostly what I call my notes from the back porch. Every night I try to take an hour sitting on the back porch and write some notes in a notebook, so my notes just tripled or quadrupled over the next few months. So it was a lot of introspection as well as trying to get information from sources outside of our media, going to the internet for information from alternative news sources around the world, see their points of view, try to mix it together into something rational.
Through your notes that you were writing every night, maybe in retrospect, what have you seen come out of that? You know, your point of view, your thinking at the time.
Well, I forgot to bring my list of 6 things, so I can't recall them all, but I included some in notes I wrote here as to why I think these events have happened and what we could do about it. And those 6 points were in the action plan, more or less. The first was to stop our dependency on Middle East oil. I think that's what's had us in that region for a prolonged period of time. And if we could reduce that or stop it altogether and put more effort into alternative energy sources, I think it's important to understand your enemy, understand their motivations for what they're doing. And if you can take away their motivations for doing what they're doing, you would think their anger and their hate would subside. And I think our meddling in and about Mideast oil has been one of the major, if not the major factor that has incurred the wrath of a good part of that part of the world. So that was big on my list. Another one was to do what I call break lockstep with Israel, and that is don't just support them at every turn and further antagonize the rest of that part of the world, because I think we've been perceived as always siding with them. So if we could develop a more equitable kind of response, that might be to everyone's benefit. And that seemed to be going pretty well until recently, when the president said that the Palestinians really needed a new leader, and we were going to wait until it happened. I think that...
How'd that make you feel?
More frustration. You know, most of my emotion is frustration. So those are 2 things that I think would be definitely to our benefit and to the benefit of the world. I think we also have to get out of this mindset of the U.S. and the rest of the world. I think the reactions I've seen and I've read about are totally understandable in terms of people's patriotism. I think I'm quite patriotic also, but I did not wrap myself in the American flag. I did not say God bless America or pray for America. I think we should be God blessing the world and praying for the world, because we're a part of a larger community. And right now, much of the world's perception of us is not very good, and I think the best thing we can do is change those perceptions, or try to change those perceptions. And one is not to become an isolationist and do what we've always done, at least in the past 50 years.
What have you taken out of 9/11 as far as what are some of the most powerful, say, images or feelings related to that?
Well, shortly after it first happened, I wrote in my notebook that I thought it was a wake-up call for the U.S. And I just might inject parenthetically, the rest of the world is now calling us America. And unless the geography books have changed since I last read them, we're part of the Americas. North America, Central America, South America. But somehow the U.S. has become synonymous with America. And it's the U.S. that's the enemy of our enemies, or of our attackers. It's not Canada, Mexico, or the rest of the Americas. But that parentheses may have led me off the question. I thought it was a wake-up call, could have been a wake-up call for most of us. But over the intervening months, I'm not seeing it that way. I'm seeing people stand united, bumper stickers saying power and pride. I find that to be a very curious one, what power and pride means. But it's a natural thing to do when you're attacked, to unite, to band together. But there has to come a period of time where you ask the question why, and what and should we do about it, not only with our leadership, but as individual citizens. Images are still there. You know, they're quite horrifying.
What has it made you restructure your priorities in life?
Absolutely.
In what way?
Well, I am just spending a lot more time trying to gather information from different sources and form some opinions. And when I was given this opportunity, I actually jumped on it. I thought, gosh, I mean, I have to wait 6 months to have something published if it's going to air on television, at least regionally. But I'm rather preoccupied with it. I managed to get through my responsibilities at school and with my family, and once those are met, I almost turn immediately to this larger matter.
Did you know anybody directly?
No,
New York, or
I did not. I know friends of friends, you know, in Springfield who had either close friends or relatives there at the time. But if I might interject something, it seems to me that our enemies have attacked our symbols. You know, when you think of the structures that were attacked, the Twin Towers, you know, a symbol of corporate America, if not money around the world, and the military with the Pentagon, something else that is a symbol to them, and the White House. I really thought that fourth plane was intended for the White House, and I saw recently they believe it was. You know, get the president's house. Because in many of these countries, if you do that, you can destabilize the country, you know, if you get the president or the leaders. But I still think that was largely symbolic. But I read a piece in the local newspaper last week, and I couldn't figure out how to pronounce his name, but the article was Osama's brains or something like that, the brains behind Osama. Did you see that long article he wrote on him? In which he said that we would not really be affected by this unless there was a loss of life. His perception of this country was that you had to inflict casualties before you really got our attention or got us to respond. And I found that to be curious, because obviously there was a big loss of life. And to simply attack symbols without the loss of life, in their minds, that wasn't going to get any reaction from us. And I would think that they, whoever they are, the enemy, I'll call them, or the enemies of our country, probably liked our response, even after a delay, to go in there and basically bring a large military force in and inflict casualties on what we call collateral, innocent civilians, which, you know, our enemies had to consider people that they killed here, you know, to be collateral, if you will, innocent loss of life. Well, we behave the same way that we have in recent history, in terms of identifying a problem and then trying to solve it with military might on someone else's land or territory. So I think that would have been their prediction, and they would have thought that to their advantage, because in the process we could be making more enemies. The one I always, the phrase I always use, I think, that gets most people's attention, because I was absolutely horrified at the military action we took on Baghdad in an attempt really to get Saddam Hussein. I mean, that, you know, the collateral of soldiers and civilians was, I think, incidental to the mission of take this person out. But, you know, as we watched on television, all these images of light flashes and bombs and devastation to buildings and to people, I thought that night, you know, if I were a 10-year-old boy in Baghdad, or if this happened in Springfield, and all that devastation took place, and I was 10 years old and I saw my family destroyed, I'd have one mission in my life, and that I would devote myself to striking back to that enemy that took my loved ones. And so I was just as horrified by that incident, I think, as I was 9/11. We've made a lot of enemies.
Do you feel that with that statement that you just made, that some of these people who don't know the histories of how these things keep building and building, you know, now you've got a lot of 10-year-old boys saying, I want to strike back.
Absolutely.
You know, not realizing that this is keep building upon and building upon. So where do you see that we could draw the line and extend our love to one another? You know, how do we change this history?
Well, I think we educate our own children. You know, give them a broader view of the world and of the history of the world. And we encourage our adults to do the same thing. I mean, I think I'm very ignorant, probably, of most of the history of the world. I wish they'd write a history of the world for dummies. You know, I'd like to read that book and catch up on a lot of holes in my knowledge. But I think becoming better informed, educated citizens ourselves, and then showing the rest of the world a different face of the U.S., try to change their perceptions. And I think we can do that by behaving differently even within our own country toward one another, and the way we try to influence our leadership as individuals or in small groups. But I think there's a lot of self-education to go on, and then I don't think most reasonable people looking at a lot more information would disagree with the point of view that we are perceived by large parts of the world as being greedy and militant and self-serving. And whatever we could do to change that image or show them another face of us would have to be to our advantage. And to the rest of the world. You know, it's not just us. It's not just the U.S. We're all citizens of the world. We all share the same planet, same space. So the better we understand one another, cultural heritages and beliefs, religious and otherwise, perhaps we can not only become tolerant, which has been a buzzword for the last couple of years, but maybe even accepting of some real differences.
What positive things do you see coming out of the events? You know, what kind of hope do you have?
Well, that we increase our awareness as individuals, as a country, of world events and histories and cultures, as I've already mentioned. That's very positive, I think. And maybe we will take a look inward as a people and realize how we've been victimized over the last probably 50 years, not only by political leaders, but by what Daniel Quinn, fairly well-known author, calls the takers. And he distinguishes the takers from the leavers. And the takers are what we're now seeing as corporate U.S. or corporate America, sort of the ultimate greed of never knowing when enough money's enough. And in the process of this grab of a very few companies, they're basically wiping out our middle class. So this whole culture's been in a state of decline in a lot of respects over the last 50 years. And if we can increase our own awareness of how that's come about and some things we might do to change that, I think those are tremendous perks for this country in particular. And if we get better, I think the world's going to get better.
Agreed. Any other thoughts?
Well, you got a pause on there? I'll look at these notes or not, or you just want this to keep running? Because we can learn, or things we could do differently.
Right.
Did I talk about the takers so far? So we know what that is.
Being i.e. corporate America, who
Right. And how
rich
few
get richer,
and how
poor get
few
poorer.
have control of all that money and so forth.
People in power don't want to give it up.
Right. Did I mention the quote of starve takers by not feeding them money? Did I? Okay, maybe I could start there if you just
Sure.
say something like you wanted to say more about
You want to
positive that we can take away from this and maybe create some change.
Sure. Right. How do you feel we can take these events, these horrible events, and get something positive out of it?
Well, one thing is we have to do something about these takers, as Daniel Quinn called them. And the only thing they understand is money. I mean, that's their whole reason for being. And we can starve the takers eventually by not feeding them money. And you and I feed the money every day. We were born in a culture to basically make money for our own survival. And then most of that money goes up the chain in the hands of a very few. So if we could find out ways to stop feeding their fire and supporting them with all this money, I think that'd be to everyone's advantage who's not a taker. So the leavers, but the rest of us, this might sound a little idealistic, but if we can get back to nature, because regardless of our religious beliefs and when we thought the world began and evolution versus creationism, all the differences, it seems we all began in nature. That's where we came from. We came from the land. And so symbolically or literally, if we can shift our mindset to getting back to nature and away from the money trail and getting up the next day to make money under now big time constraints, right? We have to get this done faster and be more economical in how we make more money. So we have time pressures on us, money pressures on us. If we could just shift our focus or our thinking back to from whence we came, basically nature, we might be able to begin to affect some individual, if not a group change. Because I think most of us feel most comfortable in nature that is off the pavement. How many people talk about a vacation if I could just get to the ocean or get by a stream or camp out? And people respond to that, I think, because those are our origins. So really we're not wanting to get someplace we've never been. We're wanting to get back to closer to the origins. And I had a thought many years ago, like 40 years ago, in my 20s or so, that the mistake we were making was developing an industrialized country where people were leaving the farms and coming to the cities for jobs and building apartment complexes, industry, ghettos, and getting people off the land. And now they're pavement dependent, They're totally dependent for food in these high-rise complexes of masses of people who aren't comfortable with one another. So why can't we get them back on the land? Can we devise a way to, in principle, if not practice, get everybody a reasonable piece of property to grow their own foodstuff? There's immediately less dependency on money to feed the takers if we all have that kind of independence that our ancestors had. So that might, that kind of reflection or wishing on our part might also be a positive outcome. And maybe more fundamental than that, are old words that I know my grandparents grew up with. My grandparents were terribly honest with one another, with their neighbors, and that built a trust. Well, I've gone from, as a kid, trusting everyone to, as an adult, trusting no one. And rather than give you my trust when we meet now, you actually have to earn it from me. So a lot of our most fundamental values have eroded. And sharing, boy, not too long ago, people shared very easily with one another when someone was struggling with something, down and out, people did a better job of taking care of one another, I think. The clock is ticking. There's an urgency to all this. I've seen some projections that if we continue on this current path, the U.S. in particular, we won't know life as we know it 200 years from now. Well, this country's only been doing what it's doing with the European here for a little over 200 years. And just think about all those changes that you've read about in history books from the time the white man got here till 220 some years later. And I've seen 60 of those years. That sort of astounds me. There's something about aging that has some benefits. And to think I've been alive for 60 of those 220 years is staggering. I've been alive 25% of the time since the Pilgrims got here. That just amazes me. So it's a relatively short period of time that this has been going on. But the way it's escalated and the way the society has changed and the way we're behaving with the rest of the world is unprecedented. And we can't continue on that path. And some projections are 200 years, others are as few as 50 years. So there's a sense of urgency about this. And after 9/11, the president said, let's get back to where we were before the attack. So he wanted the economy back the way it was and everything just the way it was. So he wasn't looking for change at that point. And one of the first calls he made was, let's get our planes flying again. Well, one estimate I heard is 5,000 planes were in the air over this country, in and out of our airports every day. Well, what's the advantage of 5,000 airplanes flying around up there to the average citizen or to the welfare of the country? Does it take some oil to fuel those planes for what's become, a convenience? We used to ride the buses to get places, and now we fly in airplanes as freely as we take a bus from one city to another. So to me, it all boils down to we each have to continue our development as an educated person. Our education doesn't stop until death if we're doing it right. We all continue to develop and evolve, hopefully for the better. So we have to encourage one another to do that in sharing ideas and having conversations. Basically question everything, then deliberate. There's no rush to a decision. Take your time. Get more information if you need it, if you feel you need it. But then respond. We have to act. There has to be action in the end. It can't just be get the information, mull it over, and do nothing with it. So I'm an activist. I'm not a pacifist. That's about all I'd say.
What other types of action would you like to see our country? You've stated some of them here. Do you think we're going too far? Do you think we're not going too far? You know, not just as a whole country, but, you know, as individuals. Because I think people can act differently in a group setting than they can as individuals.
Well, I just encourage us to be what we fundamentally are, and that's we each are individuals. You know, we each form our own attitudes. A lot of it's culturally based. But once we can see the box of our culture fairly clearly, we can at least step outside the box, reflect on it, look at other cultures, other peoples, see the differences, see the similarities, emphasize the similarities.
It seems like that's one of the harder things to do with this country because, like, we're all individuals. China, they're not individuals.
They're collective, aren't they?
They're collective.
Exactly.
But our country is made up of so many different kinds of other cultures
Right.
that I could see where there'd be pockets of dissimilarity and having a really hard time to figure out what our box is, because you've got people, yeah, we're one nation and it's great that we can have this diversity, but sometimes it seems like that diversity doesn't necessarily split us apart, but makes us not as cohesive.
I agree with you, Randall. I think what we should basically do is get naked. And I assume that won't make the tape, or if any of this makes the tape. But yeah, see our similarities. You know, share what we have in common, because I think we have more good in common than we have negative or differences that make a difference. And if we could get back to the humanity of it all and our common origins, and we can't. The other thing I didn't want to put on this, and that's fine. I assume it's over. But I'm so frustrated by the American attitude that I've seen develop since World War II again, that we are right. We are the most powerful, all-knowing people in the history of the world. And I don't believe that, or I seriously question that, especially based on our behavior. So this self-righteousness that underlies so many of us needs to be dealt with. And part of that